Jesse was the father of David the king. David was the father of Solomon by Bathsheba, who had been the wife of Uriah. Solomon was the father of Rehoboam. Rehoboam was the father of Abijah. Abijah was the father of Asa. Asa was the father of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat the father of Joram. Joram the father of Uzzah. Uzzah the father of Jotham. Jotham the father of Ahaz. Ahaz the father of Hezekiah. Hezekiah was the father of Manasseh. Manasseh was the father of Amon. Amon the father of Josiah. Josiah became the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. After the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah became the father of Shealtiel. Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel the father of Abihud. Abihud the father of Elkim. Elikim of the father of Azor. Azor was the father of Zadok. Zadok was the father of Achim. Achim was the father of Elad. Elad was the father of Eleazar. Eleazar the father of Mathan. Mathan the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David to the deportation of Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation of Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. For Matthew, these tedious details are meant to open the door to a way of understanding the story of the Bible that reveals a depth to what it means to follow Jesus. These stories that he's sharing here and how he even opens his gospel, the good news of Jesus, is quite different, I would say, than how we would normally present the gospel in our day and age. Oftentimes we hear the gospel presented in terms of a ticket to heaven when you die. Maybe the gospel in some camps is a blueprint for social justice. Maybe the gospel becomes moral or intellectual fodder to ruminate on, something we talk about. Maybe the gospel is just simply a solution to felt needs that you have. Maybe the gospel is the open door to health, wealth, and success. Or as maybe even some of us or many of us in the West have come to understand the story of Jesus as kind of a privatized and individual event where the church becomes a provider of religious goods and services for our spiritual needs. Success often becomes numerical growth, bigger buildings, and larger budgets. Oftentimes when we talk about the gospel, the thought of the cross being something that we bear is minimized, and suffering and sacrifice are avoided. As Bill Hull would say, the gospel Americana is a consumer gospel that makes faith private, the church a provider of religious goods, and success about size and comfort, and discipleship as optional. But for Matthew, what feels like white noise to us is actually Matthew's way of shaking us awake. He's saying, don't reduce the story. Don't skim it. Slow down, because what you're about to hear is bigger than any version of the gospel that you've settled for. You see, for Matthew, this story of Jesus isn't found in the usual expressions often seen in how it's typically presented. For Matthew, Jesus' story is about revealing the kingdom in its king. For Matthew, this book of Genesis, this genealogy, is both about the personal lineage and about the inbreaking of the new creation. For Matthew, the story of Jesus marks the advent of a new era in history, where humanity once again has access to the garden of the Lord, as described in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. For Matthew, Jesus is the Redeemer, the chosen one, the blessing, the King. The record of the genealogy, the book of Genesis of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. With curated attention to detail, Matthew weaves together the lineage of Jesus in such a way that it allows his audience to thoroughly grasp who this Jesus is. In fact, the one who is a rightful descendant of the Old Testament image of faithfulness in Abraham, in the image of the kingdom in David. These prototypical images, Abraham and David, served as a foreshadowing of what was to be expected of the Messiah. Abraham, the son of faithfulness, is the image of faithfulness, was the called out one, called to the wilderness, called away from home, called to sacrifice his only son, called to waiting, called to imagination. In this, Matthew can rightly say that Jesus was the son of Abraham, because as Paul would later say, he emptied himself, taking the form of the bondservant, being made in the likeness of men. Jesus would be called out. Jesus would go to the wilderness. Jesus was called to sacrifice even his own life. Jesus was in obscurity for 30 years. And Jesus had an imagination. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations. David also was the image of the kingdom in the Old Testament. He was a called out king, called to seek justice, destroy idols, unite tribes, lead the nation of Israel back to covenant faithfulness, and be a witness to the nations about those who followed the Lord. Jesus was the son of David. He is the king. He was defined as seeking justice. He exposed the idolatry of the powers. He gave a way for the lost sheep of the house of Israel to be united. He gave a way for covenant faithfulness for people in all generations. He stands as a witness to the nations about what it means to follow the Lord. You see, Jesus is connected through the lineage of Abraham and David, but Matthew's point isn't exclusively caught up in the biological connection. It's also a connection to the images of faithfulness and kingdom. Jesus is the fulfillment of faithfulness and the fulfillment of God's kingdom. Jesus is the final word on what it means to be faithful and what it means to live in the kingdom. The book or the record of the genealogy or the genesis of Jesus is precisely that. It's a revelation of the new creation, defined by kingdom and by faithfulness, brought through the chosen one. This is revealed precisely in the image of the garden of the Lord, the temple of the cosmic king, the promised land of Exodus, where the peace or the rest of God would be found, can only be found in him. For Matthew, his whole gospel doesn't begin with a rousing miracle, inspiring teachings, or a stadium-filled event. He begins with a tedious genealogy, the very thing we rush past in our reading often. Why? Because Matthew wants us to see that the story of Jesus doesn't start out with what often impresses us. It starts out most often with what grounds us. It's not about spectacle, it's about substance. It's not about hiding the flaws. It's about God's faithfulness shining through all of them. And that stands in sharp tension with how many of us have been trained to think about church. We've inherited models that led with attraction, polished programs, and platforms. But Matthew insists that God's kingdom doesn't grow out of this kind of perfection. It grows out of faithfulness and kingdom, even when the story is messy, slow, and hard to pronounce. And I think, as any good student of the Bible will recognize that this list we get in Matthew is different than the list we get in Luke, okay? I mean, that's pretty obvious, and there's lots of ways to explain that, and I'm not going to dive too much into that today. These reports are obviously different from those of Luke. Careful students of the Old Testament will recognize even that while Matthew does record this, some names are even missing from what's been given here. For Matthew, though, this doesn't seem to be a problem. However, our Western factual approach to these stories may cause some problems with our perception of Matthew's reliability of these reports. Does this in some way expose a flaw? Matthew doesn't include all the names, so therefore Matthew's not telling the truth. While some have tried, a new thing is happening. So even the doubling of sets from Abraham to David and David to the deportation demonstrates not only that they are complete or finished, these things have happened and they're done, but they also are really complete in that the Lord is inaugurating a new age in and through this Jesus. An age that finds its fullness in the son of Abraham, the son of David, the chosen one who comes near. Another layer in all of this that may go unnoticed in our haste is the inclusion of women, Gentiles, non-Jewish people, tyrants, covenant breakers, adulterers, in the stories of national shame. When he says, like, to the deportation for a first century Jewish person, that was not a great thing to bring up. To move too quickly will also diminish the kingdom of Jesus. You see, what Matthew hints at here will develop in greater detail later. That is, that regardless of social status, gender, or transgression, the kingdom is available to all. Because the King has opened the door to anyone who would answer the call, follow me. Matthew's genealogy reminds us that God works through the broken and the unexpected, which means that our past, our failures, and even our disqualified places do not prevent us from being included in his story. Matthew's genealogy redefines success through faithfulness in the kingdom, not through cultural measures of power or prosperity, which challenges often how we evaluate our lives, our families, and our churches. Matthew's genealogy invites us to see Jesus not only as the fulfillment of history, but as the one who now calls us to embody that same story. Faithfulness like Abraham, kingdom living like David, in the everyday places of our lives. And if you're good at counting, which I'm not, you'll read through these sets of names and you'll realize that Matthew reports that there's 14 generations from Abraham to David, and 14 generations from David to the deportation, and 14 generations from the deportation to Jesus. Go count that last set. There's only 13 there. Either Matthew's a poor counter, okay, that could be a case. And this has circulated for 2,000 years with poor counting, and no one made a marginal note. Or for those who consider his story of Jesus, for those who consider this story of Jesus, I believe this is an open invitation to be a part of the new creation, inaugurated and consummated in the story of Jesus. That is the invitation of Matthew, that those who would follow Jesus in the coming generations would be the 14th generation. Matthew's genealogy looks nothing like slick, curated openings that we might expect, and that's exactly the point. He refuses to let us shrink the gospel into something manageable. Not just forgiveness, not just justice, not just right belief, not just consumer comfort, and not just prosperity. Instead, Matthew begins with a messy list of faithful and unfaithful people, kings and covenant breakers, outsiders and insiders, to show that Jesus is the fulfillment of both faithfulness and kingdom. In him, the gospel explodes beyond every small version that we cling to and becomes the story that welcomes all, that transforms everything, and now calls us to live in it. Creation is the subject of the opening line of Matthew's gospel, suggesting that the very destiny of God's creation is at stake in this life of Jesus, the Messiah. And so to echo Matthew, I invite you this season to rediscover what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. Because if we're ever going to see a disciple maker in every network, in a church where life happens, we'll have to discover and rediscover what it means to be citizens of his kingdom and new creatures within his new creation. To echo Matthew, you may need to wrestle with what must end in order to allow the kingdom to grow. What needs to be finished so you can step into a new reality of what Jesus is doing? We can't reach a lost world if we're not willing to challenge the status quo. To echo Matthew, there may be aspects of our history and our lives that we've been through that could have been great or terrible, but these things need to be complete, done, in order for us to step into the new creation that Jesus reveals. And as I mentioned at the start of all this, we may believe a version of the gospel that echoes one of these statements behind me. I think we've got it up there, right? The danger of each of these is that in some way there is an element of truth. The insidious thing, though, is that when any one of these is held up as exclusive, we miss the point of the gospel that will be made known through Matthew's telling of this story. And what I have found to be true is that whatever version of the gospel we believe and we preach, it will ultimately lead to the kinds of disciples that we make. But not only this, the kind of gospel we preach will determine the structures we construct, the systems we employ, and the life rhythms that we embody. And within our own context in the West, what we typically hear is this gospel Americana, that faith is private and individual, and often spiritual practices are centered around personal development. Paid ministers are responsible for the mission of the church. The church is reduced to a provider of religious goods and services for my spiritual needs, which focuses on personal development and maybe intellectual prowess. Success is numerical growth, bigger buildings, larger budgets, better programs, and even discipleship that may not always work. The cross is minimized, and suffering and sacrifice are avoided because of comfort, safety, and convenience are the goal. Overwhelmingly, the gospel we often hear struggles with the fundamental call of Jesus. Follow me. Whatever version of the gospel we may have to be done with aspects of it before we'll ever see the mission of Jesus as a primary call of our lives. If we truly believe this version of the gospel Americana, discipleship and disciple making, they will always be optional. Being invested in extended spiritual family on mission will be optional. Even things like we talked about this summer, like bless rhythms, those will be optional. And ultimately, following Jesus becomes optional. And our belief window will become the biggest barrier to seeing a disciple maker in every network in a church where life happens. You see, a few years ago, a man bought a gym membership, and it promised him everything: health, energy, and even community. And people yelling at you not to eat bread. Sorry. The advertisement showed smiling people, perfect bodies, and all the equipment you could imagine. But you know what he actually did? He swiped his card every January, showed up for about a week, and then stopped going altogether. The membership card sat in his wallet as proof that he belonged, but nothing in his life had ever changed. That's often how the gospel functions in America. Faith is a membership, a sense of belonging, a promise of benefits, without the cost of showing up, sweating, being stretched, and being changed. But Jesus doesn't hand out membership cards. He says, follow me. And that's different. It's not passive, it's active. It's not about consuming, it's about becoming. It's not about a card in your wallet. It's about a cross on your back. And unlike the empty promise of membership, following Jesus will actually transform your life because he is the King bringing a new creation to order. As our worship team kind of makes their way up at this time, this book of the genealogy of Jesus, this Genesis, this story of Genesis that Jesus came to reveal, the new creation that he came to inaugurate, what he lived for, what he died on account of, and what he calls his followers to engage, isn't caught up in the exclusion of any of these versions of the gospel, or exclusivity, of any of these versions of the gospel. But in the new creation and the reality that Jesus came to establish, it's caught up in the simple phrase, follow me. Matthew ends his genealogy with only 13 names, not 14. Not because he miscounted, but because the story isn't finished yet for Matthew. The final generation is those of us today who would say we're disciples of Jesus, those who are following him, being changed by him, and joining his mission. Jesus has inaugurated the new creation, and the invitation is open. Not a smaller gospel of comfort or success, but the gospel of the kingdom itself, simply expressed in his words, follow me.
Thanks for following.
I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back. The world behind me, the cross before me. The world behind me, the cross before me. The world behind me, the cross before me. No turning back, no turning back. Though none go with me, still I will follow. Though none go with me, still I will follow. Though none go with me, still I will follow. No turning back, no turning back. Will you decide now to follow Jesus? Will you decide now to follow Jesus? Will you decide now to follow Jesus? No turning back, no turning back. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back.
Anyways. Yeah, there we go. Thank you, Sorrel. We are going to have our new classes kind of launching today. We've got Mike over at the Ark with middle school students. We've got Kristen downstairs in the back room. I don't know what number it is. Is that, yeah, we don't know. It's okay. She'll be back there in her normal classroom with her high school students. Mark is going to be in room 4. Does that sound right?
It's the windowless one.
Mark's in the window. Mark does not have a very good outlook for his class.
But there is no escape.
Yeah, there is no escape. Not a great outlook and no escape. So Colleen will have her class back in her normal corner room there.
There's a small window.
Yeah, with a small window. So there is some hope for the future there. And I will just, if you are interested, like last week I talked about, or Dan's going to be down in our main room as he normally is on the one side with the TV on it there. If you are interested at all in learning about, if you're interested in learning about multiplication, then you guys think we're talking about math class, I can't say that. You can tell I don't have anything written down about this. If you want to learn about what it means to be a disciple maker in your context, please see me in my office, okay, right after this. So that's all we have to say today. That's all I have to say. Go around the horn, okay. Bobson. Well, I'm kind of the program director right now, and we had about 15 students this week, so, yep. So, okay, we'll lead it out with a song. Yeah. Thank you, guys.
I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow decided